I'm Sorelle 24 years old, and until 2 weeks ago, I believed friendship meant protecting each other's dreams. Then I walked into our senior showcase and saw my entire final collection displayed under Delinia's name. Everything I'd sketched, patterned, and bled over for months was there, winning the Milan prize that should have been mine. The $75,000 sponsorship, the feature in Threadline magazine, the launch deal, all of it stolen by my best friend of 3 years. Her words still echo in my mind. You're so talented, Sorelle. I knew you wouldn't mind sharing the spotlight. What she didn't know was that I documented every stitch, every late-night design session, every creative breakthrough in my process journals. I had proof of everything, but here's what makes this story even more unbelievable. She actually thought I'd forgive her because we were friends. How wrong could one person be about another? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. But when you're living in the creative bubble of art school, sharing dreams and late-night coffee runs, it's easy to mistake admiration for inspiration and inspiration for theft. Delinia and I had been inseparable since sophomore year at the Rhode Island School of Design. We met in pattern making 101, both struggling with the ancient Singer sewing machines that seemed determined to eat our fabric rather than stitch it. Our friendship bloomed over shared frustrations and complementary skills. Where I excelled at conceptual design and technical execution, Delinia had an eye for marketing and presentation. She could talk to anyone, charm professors, and network like she was born for it. I was the quiet one, the one who spoke through fabric and thread rather than words. We found the warehouse apartment together in downtown Providence during our junior year. It was a converted industrial space with exposed brick walls, enormous windows that caught the morning light, and enough room to spread out our design materials without tripping over each other. The rent was split down the middle, just like everything else in our lives. The space became our sanctuary. My corner was organized chaos, bolts of fabric arranged by color and texture, sketches pinned to corkboards in careful sequences. My grandmother's sewing machine humming on the antique desk I'd found at a thrift store. Delinia's side was more polished, with mood boards featuring magazine clippings, color swatches arranged in perfect gradients, and her state-of-the-art laptop where she kept digital portfolios of our work. Our work. That phrase should have been my first red flag. We'd spend hours discussing concepts, sharing references, bouncing ideas off each other. I'd sketch while she talked, my pencil moving across paper as she described some vision she'd had or a trend she'd spotted. She had a way of making everything sound exciting, transforming my quiet observations into grand narratives about the future of fashion. You see things differently, Sorelle, she'd say, leaning over my shoulder as I worked. You see the emotion. In fabric, I see the market. Together, we're going to change everything. I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. Our professors noticed our partnership too. Professor Dane, the department head, would often comment on how well we complemented each other during critiques. Miss Keene, your presentation skills are exceptional. Miss Vexley, your technical execution is flawless. You two make quite a team. But somewhere along the way, the line between collaboration and appropriation began to blur. At first, it was small things. Delinia would suggest we work on shared concepts for smaller projects. She'd present ideas in class that sounded suspiciously like conversations we'd had the night before. When I'd mention it, she'd laugh it off. Come on, Sorelle, great minds think alike, right? Besides, isn't imitation the sincerest form of flattery? The friendship bracelet on my wrist caught the afternoon light streaming through our massive windows. Delania had made it from you last Christmas, weaving together threads in my favorite colors, deep forest green and burnt orange. She said it represented our bond, how our different strengths wove together to create something beautiful. I should have realized that some threads, when pulled too hard, simply break. As senior year approached, the pressure intensified. The final showcase wasn't just a graduation requirement, it was our launching pad into the real world. Fashion houses, boutique owners, and industry professionals would attend. Scholarships, internships, and job offers hung in the balance. Most importantly, there was the Milan Prize, a full sponsorship for emerging designers to launch their collections in Italy, complete with mentorship from established fashion houses. I'd been dreaming of Milan since freshman year. I covered one wall of my workspace with images of Italian ateliers, sketches of designs inspired by Renaissance art, and articles about sustainable fashion emerging from European markets. Milan wasn't just a career opportunity for me, it was validation that someone from the foster system, someone who'd learned to sew from YouTube videos and library books, could make it in the rarefied world of high fashion. Delania knew this. She'd listened to me talk about Milan countless times, had even helped me research the requirements and previous winners. When the application deadline approached, we decided to work separately on our final collections. It made sense we both needed to establish our individual voices before graduation. But let's still be each other's sounding boards, she suggested. We can share our progress, give feedback, keep each other motivated. It seemed natural. We'd been each other's creative confidants for so long. Why would senior year be any different? I threw myself into my collection with an intensity that surprised even me. The concept had been developing in my mind for months. Metamorphosis, stories written in silk. Each piece would tell the story of transformation, inspired by my own journey from foster kid to fashion designer. The collection featured hand-painted silk pieces that changed color and pattern depending on the angle and lighting, representing how our identities shift and evolve over time. The technical challenges were immense. I spent weeks perfecting the paint-to-fabric ratios, experimenting with different silk weights, and developing a dyeing technique that would create the color-shifting effect I envisioned. My fingers were permanently stained with fabric dye, and I'd wake up with indentations from my sketching pencils pressed into my palms. Delania was working on her own collection in the shared studio space on campus. She said she wanted to keep it a surprise, just like I was keeping mine. We'd update each other on our progress, the number of pieces completed, technical challenges we were facing, deadlines we were trying to meet, but we'd agreed not to share specific designs until the showcase. It'll be more fun that way, she said, like unwrapping presents on Christmas morning. I worked on my collection mostly at home, spreading out across our living room floor when the pieces became too large. For my corner workspace, the apartment smelled constantly of textile dyes and setting sprays. My back ached from hunching over intricate beadwork. My eyes strained from the detailed embroidery that would catch light and create the illusion of movement across the fabric. I'd never been happier. Each completed piece felt like a small victory, a step closer to the dream that had sustained me through years of uncertainty. When I held up the centerpiece, a floor-length gown that shifted from deep purple to golden, yellow as it moved, I could almost see myself walking down a runway in Milan. Burnley, our photographer friend who lived in the apartment below us, would occasionally stop by to document my progress. She had an eye for capturing the creative process that most people missed, the scattered sketches, the organized chaos of materials, the intense focus on my face as I worked. "You should document this more," she'd say, clicking away with her camera. "The process is as beautiful as the final pieces." I was too focused on the work itself to pay much attention to her suggestion. I just wanted to create something worthy of Milan, something that would prove I belonged in rooms full of people who'd grown up with advantages I'd never had. 3 weeks before the showcase, I finished the last piece in my collection, 7 garments. Total, each one representing a different stage of metamorphosis. I hung them carefully in my corner of the apartment, covered with sheets to protect them from dust and premature exposure to light. That night, Delania and I celebrated with cheap wine and takeout Chinese food, toasting to our upcoming graduation and whatever came next. "Whatever happens," she said, raising her plastic cup, "I'm so grateful we went through this together. You've made me a better designer, Sorelle. I hope you know that." I smiled, clanked my cup against hers, and felt the warm glow of friendship and accomplishment. In 2 weeks, we'd both present our collections to the world. In 2 weeks, we'd find out if 4 years of hard work had been worth it. I had no idea that in 2 weeks, I'd discover that my best friend had already decided which one of us deserved to succeed. The morning of the senior showcase dawned gray and drizzly, typical May weather in Providence. I barely slept, running through my presentation in my head, visualizing how each piece would look under the gallery lights. My collection had been transported to campus the day before, carefully, packed and labeled according to the exhibition guidelines. I arrived at the Waterman Gallery early, wanting to see my work in the professional display space before the crowds arrived. The showcase was organized alphabetically by last name, so my section would be toward the end of the exhibition. I walked slowly through the space, admiring my classmates' work, noting the different interpretations of our senior theme, evolution of identity. Marcus Chun had created a collection inspired by his grandfather's immigration story. Sarah Williams had explored gender fluidity through reconstructed vintage garments. Each display told a personal story, representing 4 years of growth and discovery. When I rounded the corner to the KP section, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, displayed under a placard reading, "Delania Keene, Metamorphosis, Stories Written in Silk," was my entire collection, every piece. Every hand-painted silk garment I'd spent months perfecting. Every carefully crafted detail that represented my journey from foster care to fashion school. The centerpiece gown that shifted from purple to gold hung prominently in the center, exactly as I'd envisioned it would be displayed. But it wasn't my name on the placard. It was hers. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. Some kind of administrative error. The display assistants must have mixed up our collections somehow. But as I looked closer, I noticed additional elements that hadn't been in my original designs. Delania had added small details, different buttons here, a slight modification to a hemline there, just enough to claim the designs as her own interpretation rather than direct copies. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The evidence was undeniable, but I needed documentation of what I was seeing. The fabric painting technique I'd spent weeks developing. The specific color combinations I'd mixed myself. The embroidery patterns I'd sketched and resketched until they perfectly complemented each piece. Sorelle? I turned to find Professor Dane approaching, her expression concerned. "Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't speak. I could only point at the display, then at the placard with Delania's name. Professor Dane's eyes followed my gesture, and I watched her face change as understanding dawned. She'd seen my work in progress during individual critiques. She'd praised my innovative fabric painting technique just last week. "This is your collection," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, still unable to find words. "Where is your actual display? Where is the work you submitted under your name?" That's when the full scope of the betrayal hit me. I stumbled toward the V section, dreading what I might find. Under my nameplate was a hastily assembled collection of pieces I'd never seen before, generic designs that looked like they'd been thrown together in a week. Basic silhouettes and plain fabrics, with none of the technical innovation or emotional depth that had characterized my real work. "These aren't mine," I whispered to Professor Dane, who had followed me. "I've never seen these pieces before in my life." The gallery was starting to fill with other students, family members, and industry professionals. I could see people gathering around Delaney's display, my display, pointing and nodding appreciatively. Someone was already taking notes, probably a scout from one of the fashion houses. That's when I spotted her. Delaney stood near the entrance, dressed in a sharp black suit, playing the part of the confident emerging designer. She was talking animatedly to a woman with a press badge, gesturing toward the collection that should have been mine. Our eyes met across the gallery. For a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression. Guilt? Fear? But it was quickly replaced by a practiced smile as she excused herself from the journalist and walked toward me. "Sorelle, there you are. Isn't this exciting? Look at this turnout." She spoke loudly enough for nearby people to hear, maintaining her performance even in the face of my obvious distress. "We need to talk," I said through gritted teeth. Now she followed me outside the gallery to a quiet courtyard where we'd often eaten lunch during our years at school. The space that had once represented friendship and shared dreams now felt charged with betrayal and broken trust. "How could you do this?" My voice was shaking, but I was determined not to cry in front of her. "That's my work in there. My designs, my techniques, everything I've spent months creating." Delaney's composure slipped for just a moment. "Sorelle, you're being dramatic. We've always shared ideas. We've always influenced each other's work." "Influenced?" I couldn't keep the disbelief out of my voice. "You submitted my exact designs under your name. You stole my collection." "I improved them," she said, and there was something cold in her voice I'd never heard before. "I made them more commercial, more appealing to the industry. You're talented, Sorelle, but you don't understand the business side. You don't know how to sell yourself." The Milan acceptance letter was already in her bag, I realized. She'd probably received it days ago, while I'd been waiting anxiously for my own notification that would never come. "So you decided to steal my work and sell it as your own improvement?" "I made us both look good," she said. "When I succeed, it reflects well on our partnership. When I go to Milan, I'll mention your influence. You'll benefit from my success." I stared at this person who'd been my closest friend for 3 years, trying to recognize anything familiar in her face. But the Delaney standing in front of me was a stranger, calculating, manipulative, and completely convinced that she was entitled to take what I created. "You're insane if you think I'm going to let this stand." Her expression hardened. "And what exactly are you going to do about it? Contest the submission? Who's going to believe you?" "I'm the one with the business connections. I'm the one who knows how to present to industry professionals. You're just the girl from foster care who learned to sew from YouTube." That last line hit me like a physical blow. She'd thrown my background, something I confided in her during late-night conversations, back at me as if it were a weakness rather than the source of my strength and creativity. "Besides," she continued, "you don't have any proof. It's your word against mine, and I've already won the prize." But she was wrong about the proof. As I stood there, watching her walk back into the gallery to accept congratulations for my work, I realized I had something she didn't know about. Brinley's photographs. Weeks of documentation showing my creative process, my techniques, my late-night work sessions. I had more than enough proof. What I needed now was the courage to use it. The rest of the showcase passed in a blur. I watched from the sidelines as industry professionals admired my collection, as Delinia gave interviews about her creative process, as the Milan Prize was officially announced with her name attached. When Brinley found me sitting alone in the courtyard hours later, I was staring at my phone, scrolling through contact information for intellectual property lawyers. Hey, where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw my face. What happened? I told her everything. About finding my collection under Delinia's name, about the confrontation, about the casual cruelty with which my former best friend had dismissed both my work and my background. Brinley listened without interrupting, her photographer's eye taking in every detail of my distress. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You know I have photos of everything, right? She said finally. Your entire creative process. Time-stamped, dated, weeks of documentation showing you developing those exact techniques, creating those exact pieces. I looked up at her, feeling the first spark of hope I'd had since walking into the gallery that morning. Would you be willing to help me fight this? She smiled grimly. Sorelle, I've been documenting art theft for a series I'm working on. This isn't just about helping a friend. This is about justice. That night, I sat in our apartment surrounded by sketchbooks, fabric samples, and process notes that proved my ownership of the stolen collection. The friendship bracelet on my wrist felt heavy now, a reminder of trust. That had been broken, an innocence that could never be recovered. But as I opened my laptop to research intellectual property law, I felt something else growing alongside the hurt and betrayal. Something harder and more determined than anything I'd ever experienced. Delinia thought she could steal my work and get away with it because she saw me as weak, as someone who wouldn't fight back. She thought my background made me vulnerable rather than resilient. She was about to learn just how wrong she could be. The first thing I learned about pursuing legal action is that it's expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. The second thing I learned is that most people, including some lawyers, assume you're making it up. Intellectual property cases in the fashion industry are notoriously difficult to prove. The first attorney I consulted told me, barely glancing at my portfolio of evidence, design similarities can be coincidental. Inspiration versus theft is a very fine line. I walked out of his office feeling deflated and naive. Maybe Delinia was right. Maybe I was just the girl from foster care who didn't understand how the real world worked. But Brinley wouldn't let me give up that easily. That guy was an idiot, she said when I called her from the parking lot of the law office. He didn't even look at the time-stamped photos. He didn't examine your process documentation. He made up his mind about your case before you even sat down. Maybe because there isn't a case, I said. Maybe I'm just being emotional about this. Sorelle, listen to me. I've photographed dozens of artists over the years. I know the difference between inspiration and theft. What Delinia did wasn't homage or interpretation. It was straight-up plagiarism. That evening, Brinley came over with her laptop and a bottle of wine. We spread all my evidence across the living room floor, sketchbooks, fabric samples, process, photos, even receipts for materials I purchased. She'd organized her photographs chronologically, creating a visual timeline of my collection's development. Look at this, she said, pulling up a photo from February. This shows you mixing the specific dye combinations for the color-shifting effect. Here's the date stamp. And look, she clicked to another image. This is your fabric testing, trying to get the paint-to-silk ratio right. You can see the failed attempts in the background. The evidence was overwhelming. No one could have created identical pieces without seeing my work, without access to my process, without literally copying what I'd done. But how do I afford to fight this? I asked. I am about to graduate with student loans and a part-time job at a fabric store. Delaney's family has money. They can afford better lawyers than I can. That's when Brinley told me about Nico. He's this guy I met at a gallery opening last month. Law student at Brown, but he does intern work with a nonprofit that helps artists with copyright issues. He might be able to point you in the right direction. She texted him that night, and he agreed to meet with me the next day at a coffee shop. Near campus. Nico Armin turned out to be exactly what I needed. Someone who understood both the legal and creative sides of intellectual property theft. He was tall and lanky, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and ink stains on his fingers from taking notes in class. My parents are tailors, he explained as we sat across from each other at a small table covered with my evidence. They immigrated from Lebanon when I was young and built their business from nothing. I grew up understanding how much creative work is worth and how devastating it can be when someone steals it. He spent an hour going through everything I brought, the photographs, the sketches, the material receipts. Unlike the first lawyer, he asked detailed questions about my creative process, about the timeline of the collection's development, about my relationship with Delanya. This is actually a stronger case than most, he said finally. You have extensive documentation of your creative process. You have time-stamped photographs showing the development of specific techniques. Most importantly, you have witnesses. Who can testify to your work? Witnesses? Your professor, for one. She's seen your work in progress during critiques. Your roommate has documented your process. Even classmates who've seen you working on this collection over the months. For the first time since the showcase, I felt a flicker of hope. The nonprofit I work with doesn't usually take on fashion cases. Miko continued, but this is clear-cut enough that I think I can convince them to make an exception, especially given the financial disparity between you and the defendant. Telling. In preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to this story. That word, defendant, made it real in a way that nothing else had. Delanya wasn't just my former best friend who'd betrayed me. She was going to be the defendant in a legal case that I was going to file against her. What would that involve? I asked. First, we'd file a cease and desist order, demanding that she stop using your designs and return any profits she's made from them. If she refuses, which she probably will, we'd file a formal lawsuit for copyright infringement and damages. The idea of taking Delanya to court felt surreal and terrifying and necessary all at once. How long would something like that take? Could be months, could be over a year. And it'll be stressful. She'll probably try to settle out of court, especially once her lawyers realize how strong your evidence is. But if it goes to trial, you'll have to be prepared for her legal team to attack your credibility, your background, anything they think. Will make you look less sympathetic to a jury. I thought about what Delanya had said during our confrontation, the casual cruelty with which she dismissed my foster care background, as if it made me less deserving of success. Let them try, I said. Nico smiled. That's the spirit. Let me talk to my supervisor about taking this on. I'll call you by the end of the week. Walking home from the coffee shop, I felt lighter than I had in days. I had a potential legal ally, a clear path forward, and most importantly, validation that what had happened to me was wrong and worth fighting. But the emotional toll was just. Beginning that night, I made the mistake of Googling Delanya's name to see if there was any online coverage of her Milan Prize win. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Fashion blogs were already picking up the story. Rising star wins prestigious Milan Prize with innovative textile techniques. RISD Graduate's stunning collection catches industry attention. Young Designer's Metamorphosis collection shows promise for future of sustainable fashion. Reading those headlines felt like being punched in the stomach over and over again. They were describing my work, my innovations, my techniques, but crediting everything to Delania. The worst part was reading the quotes attributed to her in the interviews. I've always been fascinated by the concept of transformation. She'd told one blogger, "This collection represents my own journey of discovering who I am as an artist and as a person. My journey, my transformation." My words, almost exactly as I described the collection to her during our late-night conversations. I called in sick to my part-time job the next day and spent the morning in bed, alternating between rage and despair. Everything I worked for, everything I dreamed of, was being attributed to someone else. Meanwhile, she was preparing for Milan while I was facing graduation with no prospects and no recognition for my actual work. Brinley found me that afternoon, still in pajamas, surrounded by crumpled tissues and empty ice cream containers. "Okay, enough wallowing," she said, pulling open the curtains I'd drawn closed. "You want to know what I did today?" I spent the morning calling every fashion blogger who's written about Delania's win. I sent them your process photos and asked if they'd be interested in the real story behind the collection. I sat up, suddenly alert. What did they say? Most of them haven't responded yet. But one, the editor of an emerging designers blog, wants to meet with you tomorrow. She's interested in the story of design theft in fashion schools. The idea of going public with the accusation terrified me. Once I talked to a journalist, there would be no taking it back. The legal battle would become a public battle, with all the scrutiny and judgment that would entail. But staying silent felt like letting Delania win twice, first by stealing my work, then by forcing me to accept it. Quietly, "Set up the meeting," I said. Professor Dane stopped by the apartment that evening, ostensibly to check on me since I'd missed her final critique session. But I could tell she had something on her mind. "I've been thinking about what happened at the showcase," she said, accepting a cup of tea and settling into our battered secondhand armchair. "About your collection appearing under Miss Keene's name. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that in 30 years of teaching, I've developed a pretty good eye for recognizing students' work. The pieces displayed under her name showed techniques and sensibilities that I've only seen from you." It was the closest she could come to directly stating her belief that theft had occurred without potentially compromising herself legally. "I've also been thinking," she continued, "about my responsibility as an educator when I suspect academic fraud has taken place." My heart started beating faster. "What does that mean?" "It means that if you decide to pursue this formally, whether through the school's academic integrity process or through legal channels, you'll have my full support, including my testimony about the work I've observed from both you and Miss Keene. Over the past 2 years, having Professor Dane's backing felt like a game changer. She was respected in the industry, with connections to fashion houses and design studios across the country. Her testimony would carry significant weight. When Nico called the next day to tell me that the nonprofit had agreed to take my case, I felt ready to move forward, not just ready, determined. "There's one thing you should know," he warned me. "Once we file the cease and desist, this becomes public record. Word will get around the industry quickly. You need to be prepared for pushback, especially from people who've already invested in Delania's success." "What kind of pushback?" "Questions about your motives. Suggestions that you're jealous or vindictive. Attempts to discredit you professionally and personally. It's not going to be easy." I thought about the girl I'd been just a week ago, someone who avoided conflict, who preferred to express herself through fabric and thread than confrontation. That person would have been terrified of the battle ahead. But that person had also trusted completely and been betrayed completely. She believed that talent and hard work were enough, that good people didn't steal from each other, that friendship meant protecting each other's dreams. That person had. But naive? The person I was becoming was harder, smarter, and absolutely unwilling to let theft be rewarded with success. File the papers, I told Nico. Let's do this. The cease and desist letter was delivered to Delania on a Tuesday morning. In June, exactly 2 weeks after graduation. I know because she called me 37 minutes later, screaming, "Are you out of your fucking mind?" Her voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. A lawsuit? Really, Sorelle? This is how you want to handle a creative disagreement? Creative disagreement? I kept my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. You stole my entire collection and entered it under your name. That's not a disagreement. That's theft. I took inspiration from our collaborative process. That's how art works. Artists influence each other. You're being completely unreasonable. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its boldness. She genuinely seemed to believe or was convincing herself that what she'd done was normal. Creative collaboration rather than outright plagiarism. Your lawyers are going to contact my lawyers, I said. We'll let them sort this out. My lawyers? She laughed, but there was hysteria in it. Sorelle, this is insane. You're going to destroy both our careers over this. You destroyed my career when you stole my work. I hung up and immediately called Nico to let him know she'd received the letter. How did she sound? He asked, angry, panicked, still trying to convince me that stealing my collection was somehow collaborative art making. That's actually encouraging. If she genuinely believed she had a legal right to use her designs, she would have sounded more confident. The panic suggests she knows she's in trouble. The legal process moved slower than I'd expected and faster than I'd hoped. Delaney's family hired a law firm that specialized in intellectual property defense, the kind of high-powered attorneys I couldn't have afforded even if I'd wanted to. Their first move was exactly what Nico had predicted. They tried to discredit. A letter arrived claiming that I was a disgruntled former collaborator who was seeking to profit from Miss Keene's success through fraudulent claims. They suggested that any similarities between my sketches and the final collection were the result of our extensive creative partnership, and that I was attempting to retroactively claim ownership of collaborative work, reading their characterization. Of our friendship as a creative partnership where my role had been subordinate to Delaney's vision made me physically ill. They were rewriting history, transforming my generosity and sharing ideas into evidence that I'd been a junior contributor to her superior creative vision. This is standard defense strategy, Nico assured me when I called him in tears after receiving. The letter... They're throwing everything against the wall to see what sticks. But look at what they're not arguing. They're not claiming the designs are original to Delania. They're not disputing that your techniques appear in the collection. They're just trying to muddy the waters about ownership. Meanwhile, the fashion journalism story was growing legs. The blogger Brinley had contacted Maya Chan, who ran an influential site called Threads of Truth, had done her research thoroughly. She'd interviewed Professor Dane, examined the photographic evidence, and even tracked down classmates who remembered seeing me work on the collection throughout the semester. Her article, The Real Story Behind the Milan Prize, When Fashion, School Friendship Turns to Theft, went live on a Thursday morning and was shared across social media within hours. The response was swift and polarizing. Fashion students and emerging designers largely supported me. sharing stories of their own, work being stolen or appropriated by classmates and colleagues. The hashtag design theft started trending, with people posting side by side comparisons of original work and copied designs from across the industry. But established industry professionals were more cautious. Several prominent designers posted vague statements about the complexity of creative influence and the dangers of false accusations in a field where inspiration was often shared and borrowed. Most painful were the comments suggesting that I was motivated by jealousy rather than justice. Girl just can't handle that her friend is more talented and successful, read one widely shared tweet. Some people would rather destroy friendships than admit they're not as good as they thought. Read another, the comments cut deep because they played on my deepest insecurities, that maybe I wasn't good enough, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I should just accept that some people were meant to succeed while others weren't. Brinley found me crying over my laptop one evening, reading comment after comment questioning my motives and character. "Stop reading that garbage," she said, closing the laptop firmly. Half those comments are probably from bots, and the other half are from people who have never created anything original in their lives. But what if they're right? I whispered. What if I am just jealous? What if I'm making this bigger than it needs to be? Brinley sat down beside me and pulled up the photographs on her phone. Images of me working late into the night, developing techniques, solving creative problems that had never been solved before. "Look at this," she said, scrolling through weeks of documentation. "Look at your face when you figured out the color-shifting paint technique. Look at the joy and pride and pure creative satisfaction. That's not the face of someone who is just assisting someone else's vision. That's the face of an artist creating something entirely her own." The photos were a revelation. I'd been so focused on the final pieces that I'd forgotten the journey of creating them, the late nights, the failed experiments, the breakthrough moments when a technique finally worked. Seeing myself in those images reminded me why I was fighting. Not for money or fame or even recognition, but for the right to own my own creative work. Besides, Brinley added, you know what's interesting about all this online debate? No one is actually defending the quality of Delania's previous work. No one is saying, of course, this collection is hers. It's totally consistent with her usual style, because it's not. Everyone who knows both of your work can see that this collection is completely different from anything she's ever done. She was right. I'd been so caught up in defending myself that I hadn't noticed what was missing from Delania's defense. Any evidence that she was capable of creating this stolen work. That realization gave me the courage to agree to a video interview with Maya Chun for a follow-up article. If people were going to judge my motives and character, they might as well do it based on my actual words rather than speculation. The interview took place in my apartment, with my remaining design work visible in the background. Maya asked thoughtful questions about my creative process, my relationship with Yelenia, and my decision to pursue legal action. What do you want people to understand about this situation? She asked toward the end of our conversation. I thought, carefully before answering, I want people to understand that this isn't about jealousy or ambition or career competition. This is about the fundamental right to own your own creative work. If we don't protect that right, especially for young artists, for people from non-traditional backgrounds, for anyone who doesn't have industry connections or family money, then we're saying that creativity belongs to whoever has the power to claim it, not to whoever actually creates it. The interview was published with additional photographs of my process work and testimonials from Professor Dane and several classmates. The response was more supportive than the initial article had been. Perhaps because people could see and hear me speaking in my own voice rather than through the filter of legal documents and social media speculation. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Professor Dane called me on a Saturday afternoon, her voice tight, with controlled anger. "Sorelle, I need to tell you something that might be relevant to your case. I've been going through my records from this semester, reviewing critique notes and project submissions. What did you find?" "I found the preliminary sketches that Delania submitted for her midterm review. The ones that were supposedly the early stages of the collection she ultimately entered in the showcase." My heart started beating faster. "And they're completely different. Different concept, different techniques, different aesthetic entirely. The work she showed me in March bears no resemblance to the collection she claimed was hers in May. This was the smoking gun we'd been hoping for. Not only do I have evidence that the collection was mine, but now we had evidence that Delania had been working on something completely different until she decided to steal my work instead. Would you be willing to provide those sketches as evidence?" I asked. "Already copying them for your attorney," she said. "Sorelle, I want you to know that I've been teaching for 3 decades, and I have never seen academic dishonesty this blatant or this calculated. What she did wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was a deliberate decision to steal your work because she knew it was better than anything she could create herself." After hanging up with Professor Dane, I called Nico to share the news. "This changes everything," he said. "Her lawyers have been arguing that the collection represents the natural evolution of collaborative work between you two. But if she was working on something completely different until the week she submitted your collection, that argument falls apart." "What happens next?" "Next, we add this evidence to our case file and prepare for her legal team to either settle out of court or come up with increasingly desperate arguments for why she should be allowed to keep what she stole." That night, I sat in my corner of the apartment, surrounded by the materials and tools that had become my creative sanctuary. The space felt different now, no longer the shared studio where Delania and I had dreamed together, but my own workshop where I was rebuilding not just my career, but my sense of self. Pulled out a fresh sketchbook and started designing again. For the first time since the showcase, the drawings that emerged were different from anything I created before. Bolder, more assertive, informed by everything I'd learned about standing up for myself and fighting for what was mine. These new designs had become my real debut collection, I realized. Not the stolen work that Delania was parading around Milan, but something entirely new, created by the person I was becoming rather than the person I'd been, the person who trusted too easily, the person who shared too freely, the person who believed that good intentions were enough to protect her from betrayal. That person was gone. In her place was someone harder, wiser, and absolutely determined to win. The call came on a Tuesday evening in July, just as I was settling in with takeout Thai food and a documentary about textile workers. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer it anyway. "Is this Sorelle Vexley?" "Yes, who's this?" "This is Aster Vexley. I believe I'm your sister." I nearly dropped my phone. Aster, my older sister who'd aged out of foster care when I was 15 and disappeared from my life entirely. The sister who'd cut contact so completely that I'd sometimes wondered if I'd imagined having a sibling at all. "Aster?" My voice came out as a whisper. "I saw the articles about your legal case, about the design theft. I wanted to call and see if you needed help." The conversation felt surreal. We'd spoken maybe 3 times in the 9 years since she'd left the system, and those had been brief, awkward exchanges that left me feeling more alone than before. Now she was calling out of nowhere, Offering assistance? I didn't understand. How did you even find my number? I'm a lawyer, Sorelle. Finding people is part of what I do. A lawyer. My sister, who disappeared into the world beyond foster care and never looked back, had become an attorney. The irony wasn't lost on me. What kind of law do you practice? Corporate litigation, big firms, big cases, big money. There was something sharp in her voice, something that suggested success had come with its own costs. But I read about what happened to you, and I remember what it felt like to have nothing and have someone try to take even that away. We arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop in downtown Providence. I spent the hours before our meeting alternating between nervous excitement and protective cynicism. Esther had abandoned me when I needed her most. Why was she showing up now? I spotted her immediately when I walked into the cafe. She looked like a polished version of the teenager I remembered. Sharp suit, expensive handbag, hair pulled back in a severe bun that screamed competence and control. But her eyes were the same as I remembered, dark and guarded and slightly sad. "You look good," she said when I sat down across from her. "Successful." I'm a broke recent graduate being sued by my former best friend. I'm not sure successful is the word I'd use. Esther smiled, and for a moment I saw the sister I'd once known underneath all that professional armor. Successful isn't about money, Sorelle. It's about building something meaningful despite starting with nothing. And from what I've read, you've built something extraordinary. She'd done her research. Not just the recent articles about the legal case, but deeper investigation into my academic work, my design philosophy, even my social media presence. Why? I asked. Why are you here? You've ignored my existence for 9 years. Her composure faltered slightly. Because I've spent those 9 years trying to forget where I came from, and it's made me into someone I don't particularly like. When I saw what was happening to you, I realized that maybe it's time I remembered what it felt like to fight for. Family. Family. The word hung between us, loaded with years of abandonment and hurt. What exactly are you offering? Legal assistance. I've reviewed the documents your attorney has filed, and while his work is solid, he's not playing hardball, the way Delaney's team is. They're trying to intimidate you into dropping the case by making it too expensive and time-consuming to pursue. She pulled out a thick folder and spread documents across our small table. Look at this! They're demanding extensive depositions from everyone who's ever seen your work. They're filing motion after motion to delay proceedings. They're running up your legal costs while their client's family pays their bills without blinking. I noticed the increasing complexity of the legal process, the way Nico seemed more stressed each time we talked. What I hadn't realized was that it was a deliberate strategy to exhaust my resources. But here's what they don't know, Astor continued. I've been tracking their lead attorney's career for the past week. Marcus Rothstein, partner at Brennan Rothstein and Associates. He's good, but he's gotten overconfident. He's used this delay and intimidate strategy successfully in cases where the plaintiff had limited resources and weak evidence. But my evidence isn't weak. Exactly. And your resources just got significantly stronger. She leaned forward, something fierce entering her expression. I want to join your legal team, pro bono. I want to show Rothstein what happens when he tries to bully someone who has backup. The offer was tempting and terrifying in equal measure. Having a corporate attorney on my side would certainly level the playing field. But accepting help from Astor meant opening myself up to potential disappointment if she disappeared again. Why? Should I trust you? Because I'm not offering to do this for you. I'm offering to do this with you. And because I have information that could change everything. She pulled out another set of documents, corporate records, financial statements, correspondence between Delania's family and the Milan Prize organization. I spent the weekend digging into the Keene family business connections. Did you know that Delania's uncle sits on the board of directors for the European Fashion Initiative, which sponsors the Milan Prize? I stared at the paperwork, trying to process what she was telling me. Are you saying the contest was rigged? I'm saying there were undisclosed conflicts of interest that should have disqualified her entry from consideration. When family connections influence supposedly merit-based competitions, that's fraud, not just theft. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Delania stolen my work, but she'd used family connections to ensure her stolen collection would win the prize I dreamed of for years. How is that even legal? It's not. Contest fraud, violation of competition rules, potential federal charges depending on how the prize money was structured. Astor's smile was sharp and professional. The case just evolved from civil copyright infringement to potential criminal fraud. We spent the next 2 hours going through her research. The evidence was damning: emails between Delania's family and contest organizers, financial contributions from Keene family businesses to the European Fashion Initiative, even documentation of a dinner meeting between Delania's uncle and the lead judge 3 days before the showcase. How did you get all this? I asked. Corporate law teaches you how to follow money trails and uncover conflicts of interest. Plus, rich people are surprisingly careless about digital paper trails when they think they're above consequences. Bye. The time we finished reviewing everything, I felt like I was seeing the situation with completely new eyes. This wasn't just about friendship betrayal or creative theft. This was about systematic corruption, about wealthy families buying opportunities. That should have been earned through talent and hard work. So what's our next move? Our next move is to request a meeting with Delania's legal team and present them with this new evidence. We give them one chance to settle this quietly before we go public with the fraud allegations. And if they refuse, then we file criminal complaints and let the FBI handle the federal fraud charges while we proceed with the civil case. Delania and her family will be facing potential jail time, not just financial penalties. The thought of Delania facing criminal charges felt both satisfying and overwhelming. Part of me still remembered the friend who'd braided my hair during study sessions and brought me soup when I was sick. But that person had been replaced by someone willing to steal my life's work and use family corruption to profit from it. There's something else, Astor said as we prepared to leave the cafe. Something I need you to understand before we move forward with this. What? Once we reveal the fraud allegations, this becomes much bigger than your stolen collection. We'll be exposing corruption in fashion education and industry competitions. There will be media attention, investigations, probably other victims coming. Forward, are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I thought about the shy girl who'd started this journey, who just wanted recognition for her creative work and justice for a betrayed friendship. That girl would have been terrified of the spotlight, of becoming the face of a corruption scandal, but I wasn't that girl anymore. The past month of legal battles and public scrutiny had transformed me into someone who understood that personal justice and systemic change were often the same fight. I'm prepared, I said, but I have one condition. What's that? Any settlement, money, or damages we win, I want a portion of it to go toward establishing a fund for emerging artists who can't afford legal representation when their work is stolen. Astor's smile was the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her all day. That sounds exactly like something our mother would have said. Our mother. We never talked about her before, the woman who died when I was 7 and Astor was 12, leaving us both to navigate the foster system alone. You remember her? I remember that she always said the best way to heal from injustice was to prevent it from happening to others. Walking home that evening, I felt like I was carrying both the weight and the power of everything that I brought me to this moment. My stolen collection, my sister's unexpected return, the corruption we'd uncovered, all of it was converging into something larger than I'd ever imagined. Delania had thought she could steal my work and buy her way to success. What she didn't know was that she'd just declared war on someone who'd spent her entire life learning how to fight for what mattered. And now, I wasn't fighting alone. The meeting with Delania's legal team was scheduled for the following Thursday, at 2 p.m. in the conference room of Brennan, Rothstein, and Associates. Astor and I spent 3 days preparing, reviewing every piece of evidence, anticipating every possible counterargument, and rehearsing our presentation until I could recite the key points in my sleep. Remember, Astor said as we walked into the downtown Providence office building, we're not here to negotiate from a position of weakness. We're here to offer them one chance to resolve this quietly before we destroy them publicly. The law firm's offices were exactly what I'd expected. Polished marble, expensive artwork, and an atmosphere designed to intimidate anyone who wasn't accustomed to wealth and power. But having Astor beside me, moving through the space with the confidence of someone who belonged in rooms like this, made all the difference. Marcus Rothstein was waiting for us in a conference room that could have housed a small aircraft. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from winning cases through financial attrition rather than legal merit. "Miss Vexley," he said, barely glancing at me before focusing on Astor. "I understand you've retained additional counsel. How ... Resourceful." Delania was there too, sitting at the far end of the massive table with 2 other attorneys I didn't recognize. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the formal setting and the gravity of what we were discussing. When our eyes met briefly, I saw something I'd never seen from her before. Genuine fear. "Before we begin," Rothstein said, "I want to state clearly that my client continues to deny any wrongdoing. The collection in question represents the culmination of a collaborative creative process between art school colleagues. Any similarities between preliminary sketches and final designs are the natural result of shared inspiration and mutual influence." Astor smiled the cold, professional smile I was learning to recognize. "Mr. Rothstein, thank you for that statement. It will be useful when we present it to the federal investigators who will be handling the fraud charges." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Fraud charges? Rothstein's confidence faltered for just a moment. "Let's start with the intellectual property theft," Astor said, pulling out the first set of documents. "We have photographic evidence spanning 3 months showing my client's exclusive development of the techniques and designs in question. We have testimony from professors and classmates confirming that Miss Keene was working on an entirely different collection until the week she submitted my client's work under her own name." She spread the photographs across the table. Brinley's meticulous documentation of my creative process, Professor Dane's records of Delania's actual midterm submissions, time-stamped evidence that made theft undeniable. "But that's just the beginning," Astor continued. "Because what we have here isn't just creative theft. It's contest fraud." The second set of documents hit the table with the weight of a bomb. Financial records, email correspondence, proof of the Keene family's connections to the Milan Prize organization. "Your client didn't just steal my client's work," Astor said, her voice deadly calm. "She used undisclosed family connections to ensure that stolen work would win a supposedly merit-based competition. That's federal fraud, Mr. Rothstein. That's criminal conspiracy. That's potentially RICO violations if we can prove this was part of a pattern of corrupting fashion industry competitions." I watched Delania's face as Astor laid out the evidence. All the color had drained from her cheeks, and she was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "These are serious allegations," Rothstein said, but his tone had shifted from aggressive to defensive. "You'll need more than circumstantial evidence to..." "Circumstantial?" Astor laughed. "Mr. Rothstein, we have emails. We have financial records. We have documentation of meetings between contest judges and the Keene family board members 3 days before the submission deadline. We have everything we need to prove that this competition was rigged from the beginning." She pulled out her laptop and connected it to the conference room's projection system. Would you like to see the email where Mr. James Keane, that's Ms. Keane's uncle and a board member of the European Fashion Initiative, specifically mentions ensuring Delaney's collection receives appropriate consideration? Or perhaps the bank records showing a $50,000 donation from Keane Industries to the EFI Scholarship Fund the same week the Milan Prize winners were announced? The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I could see Rothstein calculating rapidly, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to his client. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. Full acknowledgement of theft and fraud, Astor said without hesitation. Public statement crediting the collection to my client. Return of all prize money and opportunities resulting from the theft, payment of damages for lost income and opportunities, and cooperation with federal investigators who will be looking into the broader pattern of corruption in fashion industry competitions. And in return, we recommend reduced criminal charges. Your client serves community service instead of jail time. The Keane family's business interests avoid federal investigation that could expose decades of similar corruption. The room was silent for a long moment. I could hear the tick of an expensive clock on the wall, the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Delaney was staring at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. We need time to consider, Rothstein said. You have 24 hours, Astor replied. After that, we file criminal complaints and release everything to the media. I'm sure the fashion industry press will be very interested in the story of how wealthy families buy prizes for their untalented children. As we gathered our documents and prepared to leave, Delaney finally spoke. Sorelle, her voice was barely a whisper. Can we talk? Just for a minute? I looked at Astor, who nodded slightly. 5 minutes, she said. In the lobby, with witnesses present. The elevator ride down was excruciating. Delaney stood in the corner, tears streaming down her face, while I tried to process everything that had just happened. The friend I'd known for 3 years was completely gone, replaced by this broken person who gambled everything on theft and corruption and lost Dot in the lobby. She turned to me with desperate eyes. I never meant for it to go this far, she said. I was panicking about graduation, about not having anything good enough for the showcase. I saw your collection and I thought I could borrow it temporarily, add my own touches, make it collaborative. I thought you'd understand. You thought I'd understand you stealing my work and winning a prize with it. I thought you'd forgive me. We were best friends. Best friends forgive each other. There it was again, the assumption that our friendship created some kind of obligation for me to accept being betrayed. Best friends don't steal from each other, I said. Best friends don't use family corruption to profit from theft. Best friends don't try to gaslight each other into accepting injustice. I know I messed up, but sending me to prison? Destroying my family's business? That's not justice, Sorelle. That's revenge. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy, the desire to protect her from consequences, even when she'd refused to protect me from harm. But then I remembered the months of work she'd stolen, the dreams she'd appropriated, the casual cruelty with which she'd dismissed my background and my worth. It's not revenge, I said. It's accountability. Something you've apparently never experienced before. Astor touched my arm gently. Time's up. As we walked away, I could hear Delaney crying behind us. Part of me, a very small part, felt sorry for her. But a larger part felt something I'd never experienced before. The satisfaction of standing up for myself completely and without apology. That evening, Nico, Astor, Brinley, and I gathered in my apartment to prepare for whatever Delaney's response would be. Professor Dane stopped by with a bottle of champagne and updates from the academic side. The school is launching its own investigation, she said. Academic fraud of this magnitude requires a formal response, regardless of how the legal case resolves. What does that mean for Delaney? Best case scenario for her? Degree revocation and permanent notation on her academic record. Worst case? Federal charges for defrauding educational institutions and grant programs. The scope of consequences was staggering. What had started as a simple case of stolen designs had revealed corruption that reached into multiple institutions and organizations. "Are you having second thoughts?" Astor asked, studying my face. I considered the question seriously. A year ago, even a month ago, I would have been terrified of wielding this kind of power over someone else's life. But theft and betrayal had taught me that mercy without accountability was just enabling further harm. "No second thoughts," I said. If she'd just stolen my collection, we could have worked something out. But the fraud, the corruption, using family money to rig competitions, that affects every honest artist trying to succeed on merit. Someone has to be willing to fight that. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Federal agents want to interview you tomorrow about fashion industry corruption. This is bigger than just your case." I showed the message to Astor, who smiled grimly. "Looks like our 24-hour deadline just became academic. But the FBI doesn't wait for civil settlement. Negotiations." As everyone prepared to leave, Brunley pulled me aside. "How are you feeling about all this?" "Really?" I thought about the question, trying to identify the complex mix of emotions swirling through me. Fear, excitement, exhaustion, determination, all tangled together with something that felt like grief for the person I used to be. "I feel like I'm finally becoming who I was always supposed to be," I said. "Someone who fights for what's right, even when it's scary. Someone who doesn't accept injustice just because it's easier than fighting it." "And the friendship? Are you mourning that?" "I'm mourning the friendship I thought we had. But I'm not mourning the friendship we actually had, where she felt entitled to steal from me, and I felt obligated to forgive it. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The shy foster kid who'd started art school with nothing but talent and determination was gone. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and absolutely unwilling to be victimized. Tomorrow, federal agents would interview me about corruption in the fashion industry. Tomorrow, Delaney would have to decide whether to accept accountability or face criminal prosecution. Tomorrow, I would take another step toward becoming someone I could be proud of. But tonight, I was just grateful to be someone who learned to fight for herself. The FBI interview took place at 9 a.m. sharp in a federal building downtown. Special. Agent Maria Santos was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor who immediately put me at ease. "Miss Vexley, I want you to understand that you're not under investigation," she said as we settled into a small conference room. "You're here as a witness to what appears to be a pattern of corruption in fashion industry competitions." Astor sat beside me, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification on legal points. Agent Santos had brought a younger colleague, Agent Park, who operated recording equipment and managed the growing pile of evidence we brought. "Tell me about your relationship with Delaney Keene," Agent Santos began. I walked through the entire story. Our friendship, our shared living space, the collaborative atmosphere that had gradually turned into theft. But Agent Santos was more interested in the broader context than the personal details. "You mentioned that Miss Keene seemed confident she would win the Milan Prize, even before the judging process began. Can you elaborate on that?" I thought back to conversations I dismissed at the time as normal pre-competition confidence. She kept saying things like, "when I'd go to Milan, rather than if I go to Milan." She was already planning her acceptance speech weeks before the showcase. At the time, I thought she was just being optimistic, but looking back, it seems like she knew the outcome was predetermined. "And you had no knowledge of her family's connections to the competition sponsors?" "None at all. I knew her family had money. That was obvious from her clothes. Her equipment, the fact that she never seemed worried about student loans. But I had no idea they were involved in fashion industry organizations." Agent Park pulled out a series of documents I'd never seen before. "We've been investigating the European Fashion Initiative for several months," he said. "Your case provided the evidence we needed to move forward with charges. But it appears this pattern of corruption goes back years." He spread out photographs of checks, email correspondence, and what looked like contracts between various wealthy families and competition organizations. The Keene family has been making strategic donations to fashion competitions and educational institutions for over a decade. In exchange, their relatives and business associates have won a disproportionate number of prizes and opportunities. The scope of the corruption was staggering. This wasn't just about Delanya stealing my collection, it was about systematic fraud that had denied opportunities to countless deserving artists over the years. How many people are we talking about? I asked. So far, we've identified 17 cases where Keene family donations preceded competition wins by family members or business associates. Estimated value of stolen opportunities is over $3 million. $3 million worth of stolen dreams, stolen chances, stolen futures. I thought about all the talented artists who'd lost opportunities they'd earned, who'd probably blame themselves for not being good enough when the truth was that they'd never had a fair chance. What happens now? Agent Santos leaned forward. Now we need you to testify before a federal grand jury. Your case is the most recent and best documented example of the fraud pattern. With your testimony and evidence, we can secure indictments not just against Ms. Keene, but against the family members and organizations that enabled this corruption. The thought of testifying before a grand jury was terrifying and empowering in equal measure. I never imagined that standing up for my stolen collection would lead to exposing industry-wide corruption. After the FBI interview, Astor and I grabbed lunch at a small cafe near the federal building. My phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, legal representatives, and fashion industry professionals who'd heard about the developing scandal. Maya Chen wants to do a follow-up interview, I said, scrolling through messages. 3 fashion magazines want to feature my actual work. And someone from the Milan organization wants to discuss the situation. The Milan organization is trying to do damage control, Astor said. They're realizing they might have to revoke Delanya's prize and face their own legal consequences for accepting bribes disguised as donations. That afternoon, Rothstein called to request an emergency meeting. The 24-hour deadline hadn't technically expired, but the federal investigation had changed everything. My client is prepared to make a full confession, he said without preamble when we gathered again in his conference room. She wants to cooperate fully with federal investigators and make complete restitution to your client. Delanya looked like she aged years in the past day. Her usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by exhaustion and what looked like genuine remorse. I want to read a statement, she said, her voice barely audible. She pulled out a handwritten letter and began to read. I, Delanya Keene, acknowledge that I stole the entire final collection of Sorelle Vexley and submitted it under my own name for the senior showcase at the Rhode Island School of Design. I further acknowledge that my family used financial influence to ensure this stolen work would win the Milan Prize. I deeply regret the harm I caused to Sorelle and to every honest artist whose opportunities were stolen through this corruption. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Sorelle. I'm so incredibly sorry. I destroyed our friendship, I stole your dreams, and I let my family turn me into someone I hate. I know you'll probably never forgive me, but I needed you to hear that. For the first time since this ordeal began, Delanya's emotion felt genuine rather than manipulative. But apologies, even sincere ones, didn't undo the harm that had been done. Thank you for the apology, I said. But sorry doesn't give me back the months of lost opportunities while you were in Milan with my work. I know. That's why I'm doing this. She pulled out another set of documents. I'm transferring all prize money, speaking fees, and future royalties from the collection to you. I'm also providing a complete list of industry contacts who were influenced by my family's corruption, so federal investigators can contact other victims. Rothstein looked like he was in physical pain as she spoke. Clearly, this level of cooperation hadn't been his recommendation. Additionally, Delanya continued, I'm withdrawing from all fashion industry activities and entering a victim services program to help other artists who've experienced creative theft. The transformation was remarkable. The entitled, manipulative person who dismissed my background and appropriated my work was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to genuinely understand the magnitude of what she'd done. What about your families? Business interests? Astor asked. Under federal investigation, Rothstein said grimly. My clients are cooperating fully and expect significant financial penalties and business restrictions. The meeting concluded with a formal settlement agreement that exceeded anything I'd hoped for when this process began. Complete acknowledgement of theft, return of all stolen opportunities, financial compensation for damages, and cooperation with the broader federal investigation. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that speaking up about. Injustice had led to exposing corruption that affected countless other artists. That evening, the fashion world exploded with news of the scandal. Federal investigation exposes widespread corruption in fashion competitions. Wealthy families accused of buying prizes for untalented relatives. Young designers' courage exposes industry-wide fraud. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, job offers, and messages of support from artists around the world who'd suspected but never been able to prove similar corruption in their own experiences. Professor Dane stopped by with a bottle of champagne and news from the academic world. RISD is implementing new policies to prevent future academic fraud, she said. Anonymous reporting systems, independent verification of creative work, and most importantly, investigation of any unusual family connections to competition sponsors. What about the Milan Prize? Revoked. They're reopening the competition with independent judges and strict conflict of interest policies. Your collection is being considered for the reopened competition. The possibility of actually going to Milan, legitimately, based on my own work's merit, felt surreal after everything that had happened. Maya Chun's follow-up article, published that evening, framed the story not just as personal vindication, but as systemic change catalyzed by one person's refusal to accept injustice. Sorelle Vexley didn't just fight for her stolen collection, the article concluded. She fought for the principle that creativity belongs to creators, not to whoever has the power to claim it. In doing so, she exposed corruption that is stolen, opportunities from artists for decades, and sparked reforms that will protect future generations of creators. Reading those words, I realized that the shy girl who'd started art school with nothing but talent and determination had evolved into someone who understood that personal justice and social justice were often the same fight. Late that night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by sketches for new designs, work that belonged completely and undeniably to me. The trauma of having my collection stolen had initially paralyzed my creativity, but fighting for justice had liberated something deeper and more powerful. These new designs were bolder, more confident, informed by everything I'd learned about standing up for myself and others. They represented not just my artistic evolution, but my personal transformation from someone who accepted injustice as someone who fought it. My phone buzzed with a text from Nico. Federal grand jury scheduled for next week. You ready to change the fashion industry forever? I looked around my apartment at Brinley's photographs documenting my creative process. At Astor's legal research spread across my desk, at Professor Dane's supportive notes, at evidence of the community that had formed around supporting truth and justice. A year ago, I would have been terrified of the responsibility and attention. Now, I was honored to be the catalyst for change that would protect other artists from experiencing what I'd endured. I texted back, I'm ready. 6 months later, I stood in a converted warehouse space in Providence's Arts District, watching as models showcased my new collection to an audience that included fashion editors, boutique owners, and fellow artists whose own stories of creative theft had emerged in the wake of the federal investigation. The collection was called Unbroken Threads, Designs that Celebrated Resilience, Authenticity, and the Courage to Fight for What's Right. Each piece incorporated elements that referenced my journey, hand-painted silks that shifted from dark to light, representing the movement from betrayal to justice. Intricate embroidery that spelled out words like truth, courage, and accountability. In threads so fine it was only visible up close. Structural elements that looked fragile but were actually reinforced with hidden strength. The centerpiece was a gown that incorporated actual photographs from Brinley's documentation of my original stolen collection transformed into a textile pattern that told the story of creative theft and recovery. It was both beautiful and defiant, a wearable manifesto about owning your own narrative. Nervous? Brinley asked, adjusting her camera equipment to capture the show from multiple angles. Excited, I said, and realized I meant it. This was the debut I should have had months ago, but it was also something better, a collection created by the person I'd become rather than the person I'd been. Aster sat in the front row, having flown in from New York where she was now working on pro bono cases for artists facing intellectual property theft. Our relationship was still complicated, still marked by years of abandonment and hurt, but we were building something new based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Professor Dane had helped coordinate the show, using her industry connections to ensure the right people would be in attendance. She'd also become a mentor in ways that went beyond fashion design, teaching me about navigating an industry that could be both nurturing and predatory. Nika was there too. No longer just my legal advisor, but someone who'd become genuinely important. To me, the shy law student who'd taken on my case pro bono had evolved into a confident advocate for artists' rights, and our professional relationship had gradually deepened into something more personal. As the show began, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The federal investigation had resulted in multiple indictments, with Delamere receiving community service and probation in exchange for her cooperation. The Keene family's business empire was under ongoing federal oversight, and new regulations had been implemented across fashion industry competitions to prevent similar corruption. More importantly, a fund had been established to provide legal assistance to artists facing creative theft, funded partially by the settlement, money from my case, and partially by donations from industry professionals who wanted to support authentic creativity. Over purchase success, Maya Chun had written a book about the scandal that was becoming required reading in fashion business programs. The story had sparked conversations about privilege, corruption, and accountability that were forcing the industry to confront uncomfortable truths about how opportunities were really distributed. But the most meaningful change was personal. I was no longer the person who shared too freely and trusted too easily. I'd learned to protect my work, document my processes, and stand up for myself without apology. The foster kid who'd felt grateful for any recognition had evolved into an artist who demanded the respect and attribution she deserved. The final model walked the runway in the centerpiece gown, and the audience erupted in applause that felt like validation of everything I'd endured to get here. But as I took my bow, I wasn't thinking about the applause or the industry recognition, or even the career opportunities that would follow. I was thinking about the letter I'd received the week before from a fashion student in California whose professor had stolen her design thesis. "Your story gave me the courage to fight back," she'd written. "Thank you for showing me that staying silent isn't strength, speaking up is." That letter, and dozens like it from artists around the world, reminded me why the pain and struggle of the past year had been worth it. Personal justice had become a catalyst for a systemic change that would protect future generations of creators. After the show, as I mingled with guests and answered questions from fashion journalists, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a mirror. Across the room, the person looking back at me was confident, purposeful, completely comfortable with taking up space and demanding attention for her work. She looked nothing like the shy girl who discovered her stolen collection at the senior showcase. But she was exactly who that girl had the potential to become when she stopped accepting injustice and started fighting it. Sorelle? A voice interrupted my reflection. I turned to find a representative from the Milan organization holding an official-looking envelope. "On behalf of the European Fashion Initiative, I'm here to formally invite you to participate in the rescheduled Milan Prize program. Your original collection has been verified as authentic and selected as the winner of the reopened competition. The Milan Prize, the opportunity I dreamed of for years, stolen and then returned through the process of fighting for justice." "Thank you," I said, accepting the envelope. But I'm not the same person who submitted that collection, and my work has evolved significantly since then. We understand that. The invitation is for your current work, this collection we just saw tonight. The Milan program has been restructured to focus on supporting artists who demonstrate both creative excellence and ethical integrity. I looked around the room at the community that had formed around supporting my fight for justice. Brinley documenting everything with her camera. Aster discussing legal reforms with fashion industry executives. Professor Dane mentoring young designers who traveled from other schools to attend the show. Nico explaining intellectual property law to artists who were finally understanding their rights. I accept, I said, but I want to use the Milan platform to continue advocating for creative rights and industry transparency. We wouldn't expect anything less, the representative said with a smile. Later that evening, after the last guest had left and the venue was being cleaned up, I sat alone with my sketchbook, drawing designs for pieces I create in Milan. But these weren't just fashion designs. They were blueprints for change, plans for using success to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the article about your show. Proud of how you turned pain into purpose. D. Delinia. I'd heard she was working with a nonprofit that helped artists report creative theft, using her experience as both perpetrator and reformed advocate to guide others through the process of seeking justice. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some relationships, once broken by betrayal, couldn't be repaired, but the lessons learned from them could still create value for others. The friendship bracelet had been removed from my wrist months ago, replaced by a simple silver band that reminded me of my own strength rather than someone else's affection. The girl who treasured symbols of connection to others had evolved into a woman who found meaning in her own integrity and purpose. Standing up in my apartment, I looked around at the space that had once been shared with someone who'd stolen my dreams. Now it was entirely mine, a workspace where I created without fear of theft, where I documented my processes without shame, where I planned projects that would hopefully make the world a little more just for the artists who came after me. Sketchbook in my hands was full of new designs, new ideas, new possibilities. But it was also protected by copyright notices, process documentation, and the hard-won knowledge of how to defend creative work in a world where not everyone respected the rights of creators. Was no longer the girl who'd believed that talent and hard work were enough, who trusted that good people didn't steal from each other, who thought friendship created an obligation to forgive betrayal. I was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more powerful. Someone who understood that justice required courage, that change demanded sacrifice, and that the best way to heal from injustice was to prevent it from happening to others. Most importantly, I was someone who'd learned that you don't wait for the world to give you what you deserve. You fight for it, document it, protect it, and use your success to help others do the same. The girl from foster care who'd learned to sew from YouTube videos was going to Milan. Not because someone felt sorry for her background, not because she'd accepted stolen opportunities, but because she created something extraordinary and fought to protect it, and she was just getting started. It's strange. The silence that follows a storm. After the lawsuits, the headlines, the retractions, the interviews, there was a stillness that felt almost foreign. Like the world had exhaled and I didn't know what to do with the air left in my lungs. The apartment was mine now. Delinia had moved out long before the settlement, and though I'd replaced the couch cushions and rearranged the workspace, her absence lingered in small shadows. The coffee stain on the floor from that night. We'd stayed up till dawn stitching samples. The nail in the wall where our shared mood board used to hang, I kept the lights low most days. Not because I was hiding, but because I'd grown used to working by the muted gold of the sun as it slanted through the warehouse windows. The same light that once lit the collection she stole now illuminated what came next. My new designs were not born of rage. They weren't revenge either. They were clarity. There's a power in reclaiming your voice after someone has tried to silence it. A quiet defiance that doesn't scream but endures. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was simply telling the truth. And the world had begun to listen. The messages poured in steadily. Aspiring designers, art students from Brazil, India, the Philippines, people who had nearly given up after watching others get rewarded for what they had bled to create. They wrote to say that seeing me fight made them believe it was worth documenting their process, worth speaking up, worth staying in the room even when someone tried to shut the door. One message stayed with me the most. I thought my story would end when my professor took credit for my work. Yours helped me write a new beginning. Eliza, 19, Manila School. Of design, I printed it and pinned it above my desk. The legal victory wasn't clean. No courtroom ever offers true closure, but it was enough. Delania's confession, public, televised, legally binding, stripped the illusion of ambiguity from the theft. And the scholarship she was forced to forfeit? It funded a grant for underrepresented designers. I didn't name it after me. I named it the Process Fund because that's what they always try to steal, isn't it? The visible, undeniable path of creation. When the Milan Prize Committee re-invited me, not just to participate, but to co-curate the ethical reform process, I cried. Not because I needed validation, but because the girl who once stitched silently, in the corner, afraid to call attention to herself, was being asked to lead. I said yes. Of course I did. But I also said, only if you let me bring others with me. And they did. That year, 3 other designers who'd faced creative theft were flown to Milan with me. Their work featured beside mine in a segment called Reclaimed. Visions. Watching their hands tremble as they unveiled their first international collections reminded me of my own shaking fingers. That day in the gallery, when I first saw what had been stolen, except now nothing could be taken without. A fight. My relationship with Aster slowly grew roots. Not fast, not easy, but real. We'd call once a week, just to talk. At first, it was mostly about the case updates, strategy, outcomes, but over time, the calls became something else. She told me about a client who made custom prosthetics for dancers. I told her about a textile I created from shredded court documents and dyed silk. We laughed more than we used to. We still didn't talk about Mom, but we didn't need to, not yet. Brinley, as always, captured everything. Her documentary, Thread of Truth, premiered 6 months after the case ended. It didn't just tell my story, it wove together the voices of dozens of other creators, from student illustrators to software designers, all of whom had lived through creative betrayal. Her lens made it personal, intimate, devastatingly beautiful. And Nico? Nico never stopped believing in the legal power of art. After the case, he founded a legal clinic with an RISD's Business of Design curriculum, something no art school had done before. He called it Creative Claims. I guest lectured once. A semester. The first slide I showed the students was simple. A sketch of my stolen dress, hand-inked in a spiral-bound notebook. I wrote beside it, proof isn't just protection. It's power. Sometimes I still dream of the gallery. Not the day I walked in and saw my work under someone else's name, but a different version. A rewrite. In the dream, it's the same gray morning. The same echo of footsteps in a nearly empty exhibit hall. But when I turn the corner, the placard says, Sorelle Vexley, Metamorphosis. Stories written in silk, my name, my voice, my story. I wake up not in rage, but in peace, because I didn't just win. I became someone who would never be stolen from again. The first time I returned to RISD after everything, it wasn't as a student. It was a strange feeling. Walking through the old cotton boots I designed myself, nodding politely at freshmen who had no idea that just a year ago I'd been holed up in the East Wing studio, crying over ruined silk. A few students recognized me not for the lawsuit, surprisingly, but for the threadline cover that ran a spread of my Unbroken Threads collection under the title, Reclaiming the Narrative. Funny how justice could become fashion. Professor Dame met me in her office, her usual tidy desk now covered in folders marked curriculum reform, artist ethics, and AI in authorship. She looked more tired than I remembered, but proud. We hugged, stiffly at first, then fully. I've never seen someone change this place from the outside in. she said as we sat. You didn't just fight for yourself, Sorelle. You created policy. RISD had introduced a required seminar for all juniors, ownership, collaboration, and the Creative Commons. I was slated to co-develop the syllabus. The irony wasn't lost on me teaching boundaries and collaboration when I had once shared too much in blind faith. But now I believed in sharing with structure. In open hands but watchful eyes, I taught. My first class that fall. 100 students, some too cool to care, some too anxious to blink, all of them trying to figure out how to protect what they hadn't even created yet. I told them this: every time you choose not to document your process, you're handing over your voice. Every time you say they wouldn't do that to me, you're betting on a world that doesn't always reward honesty. Document not because you're afraid, but because you know your worth. Halfway through the semester, one student, Mina, a transfer from Seoul State after class, she held out a thumb drive wrapped in a velvet ribbon. My mother told me to keep backups of backups, she said, but I never thought I'd need them until my roommate submitted my concept sketch for a competition in Tokyo. Your story taught me how to fight. So, thank you. I kept the ribbon, tying it around the handle of my sewing machine. Some threads, when tied tightly enough, don't break. They hold. Meanwhile, the process fund was growing. What started as a one-time grant from the lawsuits, damages became something bigger, a global platform supporting artists with legal fees, mentorship, and visibility. Applications poured in from 15 countries. I reviewed each one personally, and I remembered each one. Halil from Morocco, whose professor patented his textile folding algorithm without credit. Maylin from Vancouver, whose comic series had been stolen and repackaged into a Netflix pitch deck. Isaiah from Detroit, whose choreography had been copied, frame for frame, in a viral ad. Their stories weren't new, but the tools to fight back were. We weren't trying to punish. We were trying to prevent. Back in Providence, I rented a studio loft across the street from my old apartment. Bigger, quieter, just mine. I painted the walls matte black and installed track lights. I wanted my colors to shine against the dark, like they'd had to shine inside me. The first piece I made there was called Inheritance. It was an asymmetrical coat made from shredded legal documents, stitched with thread spun from recycled silk. The lining was hand-printed with excerpts from letters sent to me by survivors of creative theft. It wasn't for sale. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be seen. To be worn once on a runway that cut through the courtyard of the same gallery, where my collection had once been stolen. The crowd gasped when the model turned, revealing the stitched words, "What you try to erase becomes louder." The applause that night wasn't for beauty. It was for memory. Brimley photographed the show from start to finish. She'd been offered a documentary deal with a major streaming service, but turned it down. She wanted to keep ownership. We don't need another studio gatekeeping who gets to tell the truth, she said. We tell it ourselves. I helped her build a grant application for artist-led media projects under the Process Fund. She won. Obviously, some victories felt circular. Like all we were doing was returning to what we were owed in the first place. But even so, full circle is better than nowhere at all. And asked her. She kept showing up. At first, it was emails, notes about legal reform, thoughts on trademark education, links to articles I might use in my lectures. Then came monthly dinners, then birthday texts. Then the morning I called her just to say I didn't know how to design something that wasn't angry. She didn't say just get over it or move on. She said, try designing something that's free. So I did. Wedding dress, actually. For a client who wanted silk organza that caught sunlight like forgiveness. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't sharp. It was soft, strong, soft like moss, not weakness. Strong like roots. I called the piece Rewilded. I mailed. Asked her a thank you card with a photo of it inside. She responded with a rare 2-word text. You're healing. I think I was, not entirely. Not forever. But enough to feel the weight lift from my shoulders when I passed the window of the gallery. where it all began, and didn't flinch out enough to sit at my sewing table and not fear what would be taken, enough to draw something. Just because it felt beautiful, not because it had to prove a damn thing. 6 months later, I walked through a corridor lined with mirrors. Not literal ones, though the Milan venue certainly loved its glass. No, these were human mirrors, young designers. Wide-eyed and half-sure, their lanyards swinging against their chests as they waited for the symposium to begin. Their notebooks were out, pens ready. Every few steps, I caught glimpses of who I used to be. The nervous posture, the hunger in the eyes. That particular kind of hope you only carry when you dream still fits in a portfolio binder. The Milan Prize had changed, not just the judges or the board. Those had been swept clean like a reset loom, but its purpose. Now it was as much about process as product. Every submission included a development archive. Every finalist had to sit down for a recorded interview on ethics and authorship. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and they'd asked me to keynote the new class. I stood behind the curtain, notes in hand, wearing a suit I designed from offcuts of Rejected, fabric each square representing a student who'd sent me a thank you message. For creating the process fund, on the back panel, I had embroidered one phrase in tiny, nearly invisible thread. Your story is still yours, even when they try to rewrite it. When the lights went up, I stepped onto the stage. The speech didn't start with my trauma. I didn't lead with the theft or the court battles or the FBI raids. I started with a memory. A girl in a foster home sneaking into the library to print dress sketches off the communal computer. A girl sewing pillowcases from thrifted curtains, turning scraps into dreams. I told them about how we carry more than fabric when we design. We carry wounds, triumphs, survival. That our seams aren't just stitches, but boundaries. That protecting our process isn't selfish. It's sacred. When I finished, they stood, not out of politeness, but solidarity. 1,000 hands clapping not just for me, but for themselves. For every part of them that had ever been dismissed, doubted, or stolen. Backstage, one of the youngest winners, Yasmin, a hijabi designer from Marseille, hugged me so hard I dropped my notes. He made me feel like I don't need to apologize for where I come from, she whispered. That I don't need to be quiet to be respected. I didn't have words for that. I just held her hand and nodded. Sometimes legacy is not a line. It's a ripple. Aster called later that week to say she was being interviewed for Vogue Business. They're running a feature on fashion and legal reform. Asked me what my inspiration was. I could hear her smirk even through the phone. Guess whose name came up? I laughed. Sitting on the windowsill of the Milan apartment, the prize committee had set me up in. The light was golden, pouring across bolts of tulle I hadn't touched in days. Sometimes letting fabric rest was as important as working it. You should have told them your inspiration was spite, I teased. Oh, I did, but the good kind. She paused before adding, more softly, I know I left you alone for a long time, Sorelle. I didn't think I deserved to come back. I'm still figuring out how to be better at this, at us. Me too, I said. But we're here, and I'm not alone anymore. That was the difference. The girl from a library computer lab would have given anything just to feel seen. The woman I'd become didn't need permission. She built mirrors for others instead. Back in Providence, I opened a studio not just for myself, but for others. It was called Proof and Thread, a cooperative workspace where young artists could document their designs, photograph their process, and apply for small grants without selling their souls. We installed locked filing cabinets, cloud backup systems, even a legal help desk on Thursdays run by law students who'd interned with Nico. Our motto was stitched onto a patch that hung near the entrance. We share our stories. We protect our stitches. Brinley curated an exhibit in the front lobby every month, highlighting the story behind a single piece. One month, it was a hand-dyed scarf from a Syrian refugee who'd stitched poems into the hem. Another time, it was a 3D printed shoe prototype from a 17-year-old girl in Oakland who'd built it entirely from library software. Each piece told a truth. Each piece was guarded like a treasure, Some nights, I still dreamed of Leny. Not in anger, not in fear, just as a presence that visited like old dust dot in the dreams. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't sobbing. She was just sitting there across from me at the shared apartment table, threading a needle in silence. Sometimes she'd look up and say something simple like, "Do you remember pattern making 101? Or your side of the room always smelled like lilac starch." And I'd nod, then wake up, the scent of dye and silence still in my nose. I didn't forgive her. Not entirely. But I no longer carried her betrayal like a stone in my pocket. I had laid it down, documented its weight, and used the memory to build a better path. That was my justice dot, the last page of my sketchbook. That year wasn't a design dot, it was a list dot of every person who had ever told me, "Thank you for not staying quiet," of every institution that had changed a policy because someone shared my article, of every former student who now taught their own peers about ownership, of every sibling, artist, friend, teacher, and stranger who had helped me sew my story back together. Dot at the bottom, I wrote, "This is not the end. This is a beginning that could only come from fire." And beneath that, in fine gold thread pressed into the paper, I wrote, "Sorelle Vexley, designer, educator, survivor, catalyst. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.